Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Ready for AI? Why the right infrastructure is the secret to success. I'm Laura Shafer, the Vice President of Product Marketing here at 1111 Systems. Well, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, who is truly a subject matter expert. Justin Giardina is the Chief Technology Officer here at 1111 Systems, and I am so glad he could join us today. But before I turn the time over to Justin, I'd like to set the stage with some brief background on where we are with the state of AI in business. First of all, it's probably not a surprise to learn that AI adoption is surging. The vast majority of businesses, 96% in fact, are in some phase of planning, testing, or implementing AI. You may be surprised to learn that only 4% of businesses haven't even started yet, while more than 30% are in early stages. But is the gamble paying off for them? According to another recent study, not exactly. Only 5% of businesses noted they are seeing any measurable value from AI right now. 60% said they're getting no value, and 35% said they're starting to get some return on their investment, but not enough and certainly not fast enough. So what's causing the problem? Why, with so many businesses adopting some form of AI, are so many of them having difficulty seeing a return on that investment? First of all, there's the skills gap, with so many organizations not having the right folks in place to manage AI. This isn't surprising considering how new this tech is. Next are technical and infrastructure limitations, then compliance and governance, change resistance, declining trust, and finally, ethical considerations. These are all huge challenges for organizations right now. They're important things to look at, but today we want to take a deeper dive on that second challenge in particular, and the first one as a secondary problem. Technical and infrastructure limitations. This is where VMware Cloud Foundation 9 and 1111 Systems can come in. And now, Justin, I just want to ask this directly of you. Why is VCF 9 so critical for organizations adopting AI, planning around AI, or beginning their AI strategy?
So first and foremost, Laura, thank you very much for such a flattering introduction. I feel compelled to do a good job now. And welcome, everybody. Good day. For those of you who I haven't met online or in person, as Laura mentioned, my name is Justin Giardina. I'm the CTO here at 1111 Systems. And what I'd like to do before we jump into the meat of the presentation around what VCF 9 brings to the table, for those of you who are not aware of or have a history with 1111 services, I'd like to just dive in really quickly and give a high level of information about what we do and what we've been focusing on over the past few years. So what we always like to tell potential customers or people that we meet is we can really break our services down into three main pillars, and those have to do with connectivity, cloud, and security. So when we think through some of the foundation and differentiation that we bring to the market from the IaaS and cloud perspective, we've been running a global cloud platform for many number of years now. We have locations in multiple geos, which I'll go over later. And then we also have a lot of supplemental services around that IaaS platform, things like cyber resilience, disaster recovery, and backup as a service. And that's what we've probably been known for, at least over the last 10 or so years in the industry. As of a few years ago, we also really started to hone in on our connectivity pillar as well. Not only do we offer things like underlay services like circuits and L2 connections and really the foundation of networking, but over the past few years, we've really grown up the stack where we also provide a lot of overlay features such as SASE solutions and SD-WAN. And I think the biggest takeaway there is not only do we offer those solutions, we offer a managed service on top of them, but we've also integrated those solutions into things like our IaaS, disaster recovery, and BAS product sets as well. Coupled with that, as of a few years ago, we've also started dealing a lot with and providing managed services on public cloud as well. We have a very strong relationship with AWS. We do a lot with the AWS storage teams, with their EC2 teams, but we also leverage Azure and AWS for things like disaster recovery and backup as a service as well. And then finally, when you really think about how all of this is tied together, really the crown jewel of what we offer here is our 1111 platform, of which we have two main tenets. One is our 1111 console. So being able to uniquely manage, operate, get cost predictions, cost analysis, have really a single pane of glass across all of your 1111 services is all consumable in our console. And then coupled with that, we also have a northbound API. So if you deal a lot with API or programmatic access to cloud resources, everything we talked about today and everything that you can do in the 1111 console is also programmatically accessed via the API. So a huge breadth of services. We offer a lot. And again, being able to combine all that in a single pane of glass is really what we're focused on. Also, a little bit more of a background, 40 plus years delivering IT services. We have a very huge regional footprint of data centers and services. The infographic on the 10 plus years probably nowadays should be around 15 plus years of cloud and DR expertise. So a long pedigree and long history there. And of course, we have all of our services backed by 100% SLA, which is financially backed. And then finally, I mentioned a lot of different technologies and different pillars, but just know that we partner with and leverage a lot of the best of breed names that you see in the industry here, companies like Veeam, Zerto, I mentioned AWS. And over the years, we've been able to get a lot of accolades from organizations such as Gartner and Forrester for some of the products. So in short, not necessarily to brag about 1111, but we have a long history of these services, and our goal is to combine all of the best of breed technologies into a deliverable solution for our customers and partners. So enough about 1111, and let's jump into the meat of the presentation around infrastructure and deficiencies that we hear time and time again from customers. So what I tried to do is break this down into three easily digestible pillars. The first one we're going to talk about is an infrastructure gap. The second one we'll speak about is the operational gap. And the third is an application gap. So to jump into the infrastructure gap, a lot of the data centers that we're used to building as cloud operators over the past 10 years, 5 years, even as new as 2 years ago, aren't really suited to what we need in relation to what we need to run for AI, especially as a cloud provider like 1111. So you think of some of the fundamentals of a data center. We have power, we have cooling, we have these very, very power hungry footprints that we need to anticipate now with AI, especially when we talk about having multiple servers in a rack with GPUs. We're starting to see things like liquid cooling be a standard. And when we relate that back to a lot of our customer and enterprise footprints, a lot of our customers don't necessarily have that, whether it's on-prem, that they have data centers within their own buildings, or maybe they're even subletting space from data center providers. These new issues are creeping up where customers want to get into the space or want to enable these applications and are having trouble with the commodities of the data center. Also, I'm going to use this word fragmented a lot in my slides. And in the infrastructure side, or on the infrastructure side, the fragmentation starts to happen when we may have a customer or a company that is looking to develop something with AI. Maybe they need GPUs, maybe they need some level of infrastructure that they don't currently have in place today. And what better place to go consume that new resource that you may need than a public cloud? So maybe there's a very easy way for you to take a credit card and go spin up a GPU instance in AWS, for example. And by the way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But where the fragmentation actually starts is that by virtue of being able to use something that's outside of your walls or outside of your prem, you're now starting to create some intricacies on how that resource is being accessed. So if, for instance, you're leveraging a GPU instance in AWS, now you need to start thinking about how are you creating a fast link to that resource. You need to think about security policy on how that resource is calling back home into corporate data. You may have to architect a network solution that's highly available so that when that GPU is needed, you have the ability to access it in a meaningful way. All things that start to divide and start creating fragmentation of how infrastructures are built today. And then I mentioned security a little bit in the current fragmentation example, but another thing to consider is that when we think about AI and some of the models that we use and some of the data that we use to get trained on, we also have to think about what is the RBAC and what is the usage, what is the security controls that are put on top of that data once the AI application is there. So it's very easy, or relatively easy in a sense, to take a bunch of data, maybe it's corporate data, public data, maybe it is private data, and leverage some type of AI tooling on top of it. But how then are you going to be able to present that data in a meaningful and secure way to the business owner who actually needs it versus maybe somebody who doesn't need it? Again, these are things that all start to come into place when we think about fragmentation and how the infrastructure gap starts to widen. Next, when we take a look at the operational gap of this, it's been my experience and a lot of the customer experience that we work with and partners as well, that when you take a look at the teams that are traditionally building these next generation apps or who's maintaining the AI strategy for companies, it's been my experience that we've seen a lot of open source technologies come to fruition. We usually see the teams that are building this using native AI infrastructure, like I mentioned with AWS. And that theory or that way of doing business to a team that's doing that is a lot different, or usually a lot different than, say, your tried and true enterprise administrator who may be running a legacy VMware environment or an existing VMware environment where they're used to using, operating systems as VMs. They're used to using enterprise level architectures and packages to manage and monitor those infrastructures. That's where we usually start to see an operations gap come into play, where the teams that are building these next generation apps are using their own tooling. They're using their own automation. They're using their own way to administer and use or get observability on top of these infrastructures. So that's where we start to see an operational gap happen, because there's no really good single control plane in these situations where, and again, it's not to say that having multiple teams focused on different products and different strategies isn't a bad thing. But when you think about launching that application into production and you have users relying on that application, when there's no single control plane and no observability plane across the operational component, that's where things start to get very hairy. That's where we get the proverbial finger pointing exercise where the storage team blames the network team, blames the AI team, blames the server infrastructure team, and so forth. And really where what happens is that either the project to get the AI enabled application suffers, or your service that you're providing to a customer suffers as well because of that. And then also, I think this is near and dear to everybody who's worked in those situations where when you have to do and work in those types of environments, the ticket-driven lifecycle, the requests, the competing priorities. I mentioned the different systems that are managing the various pieces of the infrastructure. Those all just become operational nightmares. And over time, as things get more and more complex or things get put into production, that gap also starts to widen. And then finally, the last pillar I'd like to hone in on is the actual application gap. So what we've experienced is that a lot of times we see customers go into pilots where they're maybe using an off-the-shelf framework to develop, say, something like an agent or a chatbot. Or maybe we have more savvy teams that are going out and looking at open source projects, or maybe leveraging a bunch of resources from GitHub to combine an open source solution together. Again, absolutely no problem with those approaches. But what we start to see is that now we're starting to develop things in the proverbial black box, where there's no doubt that the team that's deploying these knows these systems, but these systems are all new to a company. And when we think about organizing the operational part of that, when we talk about maintaining these types of applications, whether it's a security component or an upgrade component, whenever we start operating in these types of silos, it becomes problematic when that application actually gets put into production. Also, something I'll hone in on the application side as well, as I mentioned, and I mentioned this in the first pillar, the infrastructure pillar, is that we also start to see fragmentation and self-service issues where the application teams that are building these are so used to using things like AWS or Azure or maybe Google, and they are interested in consuming services on the fly. They have service catalogs, they have catalogs of applications, they have an API-driven experience. They're able to just get to work immediately. We've also seen a gap start to form where if your internal infrastructure can't operate in that manner, whether it's an issue of not being API driven, or whether it is an issue with not having self-service ability to things like a GPU, we also start to see that become a problem and getting back into that finger pointing exercise where people are saying, you know what, this is taking too long to develop this internally. I'm going to go out and do this on my own, and then we'll have to deal with the production or the the launching of that service in a different way. So again, all these three things are what we hear time and time again when we work with customers who are getting their feet wet with the application design. And again, look, we're also talking a lot about AI today. I don't necessarily think that this is a problem that's unique to AI. I feel that it's a problem unique to really anybody looking to have a next generation private environment for their customers or internal users. So what does VCF actually bring to the table in relation to these three pillars? Well, first and foremost, the AI native cloud platform is really a game changer in the way an enterprise, or really us as a cloud provider, consume these types of resources. So from the VMware or legacy VMware infrastructure, things like Virtual Center, ESXi, virtual machines, we still get the luxury of having all of that, all of the observability of that, having cost analysis of those things, performance and alerting. So again, having that end-to-end visibility across the tried and true VMware ecosystem is there. But more importantly, being able to really have an umbrella management platform on top of net new services. So we talked about containers and Kubernetes. We talked about GPUs. We talked about LLM libraries. These are all things that with VCF now, and a cloud operator or an enterprise operator has the ability to control end to end. So not only can we give that self-service, and not only can we offer a more modern experience for our consumers or customers, but we can also control that, manage that, have life cycle on that. And that's a huge game changer in our next generation designs. Also, when we think about the unification of the private cloud infrastructure, again, being able to have new concepts that are outside of just virtual machines, things like Kubernetes clusters, being able to offer containers in the same management domain. And I think most importantly is when you think about how, let's call it a multi-technology application works, there's a lot of components that could be put on next generation technologies or latest generation technologies. But there's a lot of applications that also require other components. So your enterprise may have corporate data or private data that lives within virtual machines from traditional VMware environments. And maybe your application team has built this new application using Kubernetes and clusters. And then maybe there's a storage component that is using something like object storage. The idea is that, or the great news is that since VCF unifies all those components under a common management domain, and also with NSX networking, allows those components to speak to each other in a seamless way. Now that silos or those gaps that I have presented in the earlier slides go away, because not only can you do things like create policy on how those applications talk to each other, actually create the binding of services that speak to each other. As operators now, we can not only control the life cycle of that, but we have complete observability to all that. Again, getting rid of that finger pointing type of exercise. So you could say, hey, I know this application is working correctly because now I can see and control all of the components and the underlays of those components in one common platform. Also, when we talk about GPUs, it's not to say that the power and cooling infrastructure gap isn't always there, but with VCF and working with a provider such as 1111 Systems, it makes it very easy to consume GPUs in a more meaningful way. So even though that GPU may not be in your data center, or maybe it is, the idea that we can not only control the low latency access to that GPU, we can control policy on what services or what data that application using that GPU can access, and most importantly, the ability to consume those as a service. So something I neglected to say on the earlier slides, and what we see as an infrastructure problem as well, as we all know that in today's current times, the pricing of GPUs, the pricing of memory, really the pricing of servers in general is through the roof. So a lot of times we see a barrier to entry for customers is the actual cost to purchase the infrastructure needed to run these. So that what better way to use a service provider than being able to use those as a service. And again, being able to offer those to our customers, whether we're dedicating GPUs as instances or on instances for customers, or leveraging a technology that VCF brings to the table where we can shard out or share GPUs in a vGPU methodology, really makes not only the pricing very attractive to a customer looking to deploy an AI application, but also with the VCF components makes that single pane of glass management really come to fruition. And then finally, a lot of times we hear, where do I actually get started? We know that we can go home and use things like Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT. Those things are so ingrained in our culture now. Our users are expecting that from internal systems as well. But there's a big leap between, using something like ChatGPT to figure out the best recipe that you want to cook, and using ChatGPT or something like an agent on top of private company data. Well, the good news with VCF is that with the private AI features and also some supplemental features with Tanzu, the middleware needed to get started with an AI application is all provided for you. So whether that's just simply leveraging a commodity like a GPU to maybe getting started with an agent or an agent builder, a lot of that platform is there for the application builder to use, as well as a lot of the supplemental resources needed. So like when we talk about building a model or using something like an agent builder, having the Postgres database behind it, or maybe the plumbing needed for the networking so that you can control what your model is going to learn from. All of that functionality, again, is built into VCF, and a very easy way to get started on the building of that application. So by no means has this been an exhaustive list of every single feature that VCF offers to us today. I'm only really scratching the surface on what specifics are there for AI applications, as well as some of the benefits that we can offer as a provider, or really any Broadcom partner that's using VCF to you. And look, if there's any questions or any call outs that you would like to get some more information on, please get in touch with us. I'd be happy to go on a little bit more. But with that, I'd like to pass it on back to Laura.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. And I think Justin's made it abundantly clear that no matter where you are with AI, whether you're still trying to wrap your head around it or are fully implementing your AI strategy, 1111 can help you. We can help you modernize, protect, manage your IT. And we have the AI-enabled infrastructure you need now and in the years ahead. We can help you assess your existing infrastructure, design what you need, help you plan and install it, test it, support it, manage it, you name it. We can help you do it. We can help you take advantage of advanced AI technology as you move your workloads to our advanced VMware-based infrastructure. And finally, as we take a look at your questions, one thing we did want to discuss, and we discuss a lot, is how AI is now part of cyber resilience on both sides of the equation. We recently had our first ever global cyber trend survey and published our first ever cyber trends report. And if you follow that QR code there and download the report, you can understand the true scope of the cyber attacks that are happening right now. So Justin, I'm going to turn to you again to help us answer some of these questions that have come in. I'm taking a look at them now. Okay, here's one. We've already invested in vSphere. We are looking to move to VCF. What are the biggest gotchas to watch for as we plan our move to VCF 9?
That is a great question. So working through a lot of migrations, not only with existing customers and our own infrastructure, as well as looking at greenfield environments. There's some good news, and I won't necessarily say it's bad news, but there's some things to consider. So as far as the good news goes, if you're a customer of Broadcom and are used to vCenter and ESXi, maybe or maybe not, you have NSX involved. All of those components are there. They're the same in relation to what their operational aspect could be or used to be. They're obviously just later versions. So there's more features. I don't want to sell short the functionality of those. But if you're used to that, there's really nothing that's going to change for you. The other thing that comes to fruition is a lot of us, especially of years ago, a lot of the VMware stack, if you will, or the VCF stack was added on or a la carte in the past. So maybe you work at an enterprise that had vCenter licensing and you used ESXi, of course, but maybe you didn't spring for NSX, or maybe you didn't spring for some of the operations like VCF operations. The good news is that a lot of that functionality is not only available and contained within the licensing that you use now, but it's also very easily set up and automated in the way that it's set up. So I think the good news there is that based on that last slide that I spoke about everything being integrated and managed and lifecycle managed in the same way, you are able to basically import your existing environments into VCF and then start leveraging those technologies on top of it to gain more functionality. And again, that means just to keep status quo. So if you are a shop today with a bunch of VMs and you need to migrate from vSphere 8 to VCF, I don't necessarily see that being a problem at all. It's not a huge technical lift or whatever. I think the other part of that is that if you are not used to using things like NSX, or you are new to containers and Kubernetes, to enable those services is relatively easy, but I wouldn't look at it as a gotcha. It is net new functionality, right? So there is a little bit of a learning curve on how things like the vSphere supervisor works, how Kubernetes clusters and containers get deployed. But the good news, again, is that your administration interfaces are all there. You can manage a lot of this through VCF operations and vCenter. And you don't need to necessarily be an open source expert to enable these types of services. And then again, my culmination slide that I mentioned before is that once these things are deployed, you're able to centrally manage them, get observability, get alerting on them, just like you're used to with virtual machines in vCenter today. All of that's there. So I wouldn't necessarily look at it as a gotcha. I would suggest to do your homework before you do that upgrade. Get used to terminology, get used to this VMware super or the vCenter vSphere supervisor, and from there, like, just let it rip.
Okay, our next question is a little pointed. Why should we work with 1111 systems for our AI strategy? Where does a managed services partner add the most value in an AI and VCF9 strategy? Is it just skills gap and ops, or can you help with costs too?
I think it's really all the above. When we talk about costs, I mentioned it previously, where the price of servers and GPUs nowadays is really through the roof. And that doesn't necessarily mean that 1111 is immune to that. But what it offers consumers or potential customers is the idea that you don't need to go invest in all the things required to run those, not only the data center space, but the servers. And you could leverage a partner like 1111 Systems to use only what you need. So whether that's a way that you're leveraging the GPU from a time perspective, or maybe you have dedicated GPUs 24/7, the idea is that you don't have to make a CapEx purchase and use an OpEx model to that is very attractive to a lot of our customers. And then when you think about 1111 as a whole, and I think one of the things we strive for as a company is that we can offer end-to-end services in relation to how you would use our services for AI. So again, going back to the GPU model, let's say you have some GPU-enabled instances in our cloud, and you still want to maintain control of the data on-prem, or maybe there's other services or resources that you've already constructed on-prem. The idea that we could help you with that network connectivity. We have a whole security portfolio that we could layer on top of that. The idea that we could really deliver a turnkey solution to a hybrid approach, if you choose to go that way, is definitely a benefit of what we do. And then also, if you are looking, like a lot of our customers are, to actually get out of the on-prem space, get out of managing your own data centers, get out of the CapEx purchases, the good news is that we could offer an end-to-end solution to not only your next generation AI stuff, but if you needed to migrate your existing VM infrastructure over to 11.11, we also offer those services as well, not only from a network perspective and security perspective, like I mentioned, but we also have migration services for things like IaaS as well. So I think with 11.11 specifically, again, what we strive for is being multi-service and being able to wrap all those with a management component is what makes us a little bit different from the rest of the competition.
Okay. Before I go to our next question, I did have someone ask me to throw up that QR code one more time. So I'll leave that up while I go to our next question. Our company is still in AI planning. If you had one thing to tell us that we need to do right now, one recommendation for us over the next 12 to 18 months, what would that be?
You know, I could relay that to really two suggestions. And again, this is totally going off of experience of what we've done and what we've been able to achieve over the last year. And I would look at that as an internal suggestion, as well as we'll talk about, let's call it a roll your own or an AI application development suggestion. So on the internal, I would say, look, there's a lot of things out there nowadays. There's a lot of platforms that you can either run in on-prem. There's projects like Onyx and Pipes Hub that are very applicable to on-prem type of deployments. And we also can leverage SaaS services out there like an Amazon Q Business or a Glean. The biggest thing I would say to that is just make sure you have a plan. Make sure you define goals on what you want to achieve. Once the application gets deployed, if everything's deployed correctly, you create all the connections into your data, whether those are SaaS applications like Salesforce or 365, or whether you're doing custom data analysis on internal data. I would just make sure you define the goals, because what we've personally experienced is that once the cat's out the bag and once people can start consuming AI internally, really the scope drift starts to really, and using my terms from before, you have a very, very big gap on what's being worked on versus the scope drift and what people expect from it. I would say, though, that once that starts and you start get some mileage under your belt, it really permeates within the company very quickly. So internally here at 11.11, we deployed some internal enterprise search as well as some agents and connections into our enterprise data. And within the past even 6 months, the amount of work and amount of automation we've been able to do have been massive. On the application side, I really would just reiterate what I talked about earlier around the infrastructure, operational, and applications gap. By no means am I saying prototyping something isn't the way to go, getting out an MVP. Maybe you do need to cobble some technologies together to have a deliverable. But the biggest thing I would say is once that happened and once you actually define what you want to do and get started, I couldn't stress enough that really putting something out of demo mode into production mode is a big task. And I would just make sure that you're considering all of the tooling needed, all the observability and monitoring needed to take whatever you cobble together or whatever you create in combination to develop that application, and just really make sure that it's bulletproof and production ready.
Okay. Well, with that question, we are going to wrap things up. And thank you so much, Justin. If we didn't have a chance to get to your question today, we'll get back to you over the next few days. But on behalf of everyone here at 11.11 Systems, we want to thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Have a great day.